Hello. And I'm waiting for my little screen to start, but I think I'm all set up here and starting in with this morning's Facebook Live. I have Mr. Pippin here this morning, and he's settling in still. So welcome. Uh, it's glad to happy to see you again on a Saturday morning. So today I was thinking about what is it I want to check in with you about. I'm going to spend a little bit longer with you today. I'm going to spend here about an hour because my Tai Chi, I'm not going to that today. I have appointments later today. This is the first week of every month when I hold general public consults, and I open up a Saturday because some people can't make it during the days of the week. And so I'll have appointments later today, so I'll just spend a little bit more time with you this morning. And I've been thinking, there we go, settled in there. I've been thinking about what I want to talk with you about today. And I think what I want to do is sort of provide a context for you about where you are and what's going on in your world so that it's kind of like my son does Dungeons and Dragons, and he's like a dungeon master. And it's like describing the dungeon that you're in, and so that you can kind of orient to the path of escape. And so that's where I think I'd like to go. But I'm going to start off in a bunch of other directions at first. The first thing I kind of want to talk about is just kind of get off my chest a little bit about the stupidity of forensic psychologists, because that's where I'll be talking about the context that you're in and what's going on with those people. And I want to show you a book. I've done this before about books from the garage. The book Family Evaluation by Murray Bowen, Michael Kerr. Murray Bowen is among, if not the top family systems therapist. Bowenian family therapy. It's got a whole school named after him, along with Mnuchin on structural, Chloe Madonis, Jay Haley on strategic family systems therapy. They're all family systems. They take slightly different approaches. A book by one of the top family therapists called Family Evaluation. Now, if you're a forensic psychologist doing a family evaluation and you have one of the top family psychologists writing about you think that would be an important book to read and apply. Okay, so that would be triangulation and cross-generational coalitions, emotional cutoffs, things like that. So it just drives me crazy that this is like published in what, 1980s or something? 1988. 40 years ago. Family evaluation. And they don't apply it's like they don't apply family systems constructs to evaluating families. Just drives me crazy. That's just the tip of the iceberg. So I wanted to bring that up. Well, good morning. Oh, I'll check my volume setting. I don't know about my volume setting. I'll try to speak up, but I'm not sure I can do much with my volume setting. So the second thing I want to do in looking at sort of just general background context of where you are and things is I know there's some people who are looking to expand on my work, which is great. That's exactly what it's supposed to do. So I provided the foundation into attachment and family systems and complex trauma and child development, a lot of different ways. I've applied the context of knowledge. And once we do that, all that knowledge becomes available. And so take it, apply it, and as more knowledge comes in, apply that. As different knowledge comes in, apply that. And it opens up a whole world of solutions to us. And that's the problem when we use parental alienation as a construct. It's a dead end. There's no research associated. There's no associations associated with it. There's just nothing. It's a dead end. And it's a symptom of the pathology. It's the pathogen actually created the concept of parental alienation and created the field of forensic psychology. That's a bold statement that a pathology can do that, but this one can. And so those were both symptom features symptom expressions of the pathology that's within the family courts. And so I'll be discussing that more as we go forward on things. But I wanted to talk with those who are expanding out from me as to where the directions I see that this is most fruitfully explored and expanded into. And that will be early childhood mental health, interestingly, to go back into understanding what's called the intersubjective field. And so there's two relationship systems, attachment, and everybody hears me talking attachment and John Bowlby and stuff. There's a second relationship system called intersubjectivity. And they work really closely together, but they're two different systems. And this one is psychological connection. This would be the enmeshment that the family systems talks about. This would be the mind control or brainwashing that you people talk about. It's intersubjectivity is the system, brain system, that's a problem. And it's affecting the attachment system, and it's coming from all sorts of other places. But, and so it's that intersubjectivity system that I think would be most fruitfully applied, but I can't get there personally because I'm still back in 1980s with family evaluation. Holy cow! So so intersubjectivity, the places to go with that is probably the starting point is Daniel Stern and the present moment in psychotherapy and everyday life. The first half of this book is about intersubjectivity. The second half is about applying that in the moment or in the present moment. Brilliant book, brilliant guy. And a lot of, I can even use the present moment in this situation, expand on that, but that's a little too complicated for everybody. But just the intersubjectivity, the first half of the book, talking about it, and mirror neurons and all the stuff with that, that's the guide to expand into. And then, but even more so, into his foundational book, which is The Interpersonal World of the Infant, the first year, and the developing psychology of the infant. This is going to be important for a lot of the intersubjectivity skills, like attunement, misattunement, affect, vitality affects, just a whole process of how that intersubjectivity forms and how we do it and how it relates. And so for advanced people, this is ultimately the place we're going. 20 years after I'm dead, once this reaches like specialized professional and we get up to the top, Stern will be required knowledge and reading Interpersonal World of the Infant for dealing with court-involved people who are 12 and 14 years old, because it has to do with how the brain works and the particular brain systems that are involved. The final thing before kind of moving on to your context and your journey is I think I have a lot of background in a lot of areas, and so I can work from a behavioral perspective, stimulus control, getting the cue structure that's eliciting the behavior, applied behavioral analysis, functional behavioral analysis. I can do all that behavioral stuff. I can also do family systems, cross-generational coalitions, emotional cutoffs, boundary violations, all that kind of family system stuff. I can also do the humanistic existential. That's the primary school I work from, and so you'll see a lot of that work in my just foundational work as a psychologist. But I'm also grounded in psychoanalytic, particularly COHUT and self-object functions and those sorts of things. That's why in the list of all the knowledge, you'll see the last one is COHUT and self-psychology, because that's the psychoanalytic people. And they have valuable information to add to the family pathology here in the courts. That would be Kernberg as well, and broadening out into the Masterson and other psychoanalytic people. But within that context, I'm also grounded in Jungian psychology. I thought about one point going to be a Jungian analyst, and I went down and interviewed with them. But at that point, I was heading into child trauma stuff, and I just didn't see where the two could meet, child trauma and Jungian psychology. And so I didn't see necessarily the need. But I've read everything by Jung. I've worked with dream analysis and various things in my practice. So I wanna bring up a couple of more books just to kind of orient you, because we are in archetypal stuff. There's a lot of archetypal stuff moving around us, and you've heard me kind of frame up some of that. Like the current archetype that I see is the mirror, like you know, Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, the magic mirror. It's to reveal that which is hidden, and it's archetype that's the prelude to the rebirth, to the cauldron of rebirth or the phoenix or whatever the rebirth imagery is. Before that, there's the mirror of that self reflection that then allows for the greater self awareness and transformations in self awareness to occur. But it starts with the self reflection, and that's where we're at right now. We got a lot of conflict going on. There's a lot of um, stuff that's provoking us to look at ourselves, and that's the theme within the family courts. We need to self examine, and that's what they're not doing. The APA, AFCC, everybody else is just going on doing the status quo. We've had 40 years of this experiment with forensic psychology and parental alienation. It solved nothing in 40 years, but we have 40 years of experience in failure. So therefore, it's time to reevaluate the situation. APA, come back, hold a conference. Let's get some experts in. Let's look at the situation, and then decide how we fix the family courts. What do we do in psychology to resolve the issues in the family courts? And that self-reflective process has not yet occurred, and that's been truncated by the Gardner PAS people, because when you propose a new pathology, then you have to define the terms, and we have to argue about what does it mean, this particular term or that particular term. But they don't define any of their terms. They're all loose. What's a campaign? What's a, you know, independent thinker phenomenon? It's just not well defined, and as a result, everything there's no ground or no basis to build on with anything in psychology. And because we have such destructive ethics and professional practices in forensic psychology, we need to establish some sort of baseline. Now, that's not where we end. We actually go all the way to the best possible, but at least we got to get a baseline. And that baseline is the mandatory APA ethics code. And so that's what I'm working on right now, is just get a baseline in forensic psychology, and then we can start working up. The but let me describe for you a little bit of context, and then I'll go back to kind of Jungian at the end. Is the context for that surrounds you right now? It's helpful to understand, because parents are coming into a situation, they're disoriented by the pathology, they're just getting out of a marriage and divorce, and they didn't think they would be getting all this kind of crazy nonsense going on. And so the the they're fresh and new and disoriented. Dorsey refers to it as being destabilized, and that's a good way to talk about it. That the pathogen has particular source code, and I've read the source code, that is designed to destabilize parents. And one way is to drive you into the family courts and sap you of all your money, so you don't have the financial resources to fight. There's other ways it does it. Puts you on the defensive with these false allegations and questions reality, so you're constantly having to prove reality. 1,000 ways, and you got your child saying, I hate you. And 1,000 ways it seeks to destabilize you and trigger your fears and get you moving in a reactive approach to it. And we need to kind of calm the fears and respond rather than react. And get out of the patterns that it's triggering us into, the complementary patterns to its pathology. And so let me talk about sort of the context for parents who are coming in, so you can kind of understand the path we need to get out of this. So back in about the 1980s, and I was there for all of this I'm a clinical psychologist, so I was watching it pass on through. And back in the 1980s, there was a lot of conflict going on around divorce, because divorces were increasing. After the 60s and 70s, people started divorcing. And it comes from a cultural thing. Before, you stay together for the children, that was the value in the 50s and stuff. Now it was better to leave for the children and have separate, divorce. And so people moved into divorce much more socially acceptable in the 80s. And that presented the family courts with an issue around child custody that they never quite faced to that extent. Who gets custody? The previous 1940s and 30s stuff is mom. Mom always gets custody because that's just mom and the child. That's her domain. In the 1800s, it would have been dad because everybody belongs property to the dad, so dad gets custody of everything. So it's a cultural decision, we encountered it really severely in the 1980s as all these divorces rise up. Now, because this is narcissistic and borderline pathology, then the parallel process of splitting takes place. And if you work with borderline personality or narcissist, um, you're familiar with staff splitting or the parallel process of splitting, where if you have multiple professionals, one takes on the role of saying, "Oh, we should be more nurturing towards the patient." The other says, "No, we should be more structuring towards the borderline patient." And then the therapists start fighting. This one becomes the nice one. We should be nicer to and this one becomes the mean one. We should use more structure. And we get in the splitting fight created by the borderline. And in psychology, in clinical psychology, when you're in group supervisions or any sort of group of psychologists, particularly group supervisions, when the first person who notices staff splitting, that the staff are fighting about a patient or fighting about a supervisee, that psychologist or mental health person is supposed to say splitting. And so in the group, you just go splitting, and then everybody stops and goes, "Okay, is there staff splitting here? Are we arguing?" And yeah, they're taking polls, and they're on polar extremes of the argument, and everybody needs to come back to the middle. And the polls might even need to switch so they can argue the other side for a bit to kind of get them back in the middle zone. And so that's how we handle the splitting. Well, that happened just all over psychology surrounding the family courts. All the therapists took sides with whoever they were doing therapy with. Mom's therapist would take her side, dad's therapist would take her side, and everybody, the psychologist would be fighting around the family as well, which was the court just has dueling psychologists then. So what psychology did was came in and said, "Stop. Everybody just stop working in the courts. We're going to create this own subspecialty practice called forensic psychology." Forensic psychology already kind of existed. They were competency hearings for old people or insanity defense for trial, those sorts of hearings around competency mostly. But then they said, well, they're working in the courts and these families are in the courts. Let's just expand them out to deal with the court system. So they created their own subspecialty practice in psychology called forensic psychology. Now, all psychologists are licensed as clinical psychologists. So they get licensed that way, these years of supervision. Then they move subspecialty into forensic. Now, for me, that a similar subspecialty is early childhood mental health, 0 to 5. During that period, the brain is coming open, all sorts of systems, and it's like going back to Daniel Stern and the interpersonal world of the infants. If you're going to work 0 to 5, you have to know specialty knowledge about how the brain works and what systems are coming along online at 1 year, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, 36 months, 48 months, and 5 years. You have to know all the brain stuff that's taken place. So early childhood mental health is a subspecialty. You're not allowed to practice there 0 to 5 unless you do some extra consultation or unless you're specialized in that. But and so that would be a similar early child. But us in early childhood, we're still clinical psychologists: assessment, diagnosis, treatment. Okay, and we rely on the established knowledge, Stern and the research, and Ed Tronick and people. What they did with forensic psychology was wrong. They moved them out, and so they're no longer clinical psychologists. They no longer assess, diagnose, or treat pathology. Instead, they decide on custody schedules. That's the judge's decision. And the major problem with that is that as doctors, we are not allowed to hurt people. Anyone. It goes back to the Hippocratic Oath where we do no harm. But in psychology, that's standard 3.04, which is avoiding harm. We are not allowed to harm anybody. And if you look at 3.04b, we're not even allowed to participate in enhanced interrogation of terrorists. We're not allowed to harm terrorists, even if they can give us information that will save hundreds of people. Psychologists are not allowed to hurt people. That means anyone. That means even parents, if we think they deserve to be hurt for some crazy reason. And when we restrict either parent's time and involvement with their child for anything other than child abuse, if we restrict that parent's time and involvement, that's going to hurt the child's attachment bond to that parent, which is going to hurt the child and is going to hurt that parent. And so no matter what we do on custody, in the absence of child abuse, each parent should have as much time and involvement with their child as possible. And any decision other than that will harm somebody, and we're not allowed to do that. The solution for us psychologists is to remain in treatment. So we diagnose the problem and then we fix it, whatever it is. That way nobody is harmed because we fix whatever the problem is. That's clinical psychology. The moment forensic psychology leaves that, they're no longer treating things, they're no longer fixing things, therefore they're just harming people. And so at a fundamental level, that standard 3.04, it just rips me apart that the psychologists have adopted a role where they feel justified harming people. I'm working with parents who've had their hearts ripped out and lost their children because of the decision of a psychologist. You're not allowed to make those decisions, Mr. or Miss Psychologist. No. Dr. Psychologist, no. That's not within your scope to go around deciding who deserves to have a child and who doesn't deserve to have a child. Is there child abuse? That's the question to answer, because then we need a child protection response. But before you start taking kids away from parents, you have to have a justification, which is child abuse, child protection. So stand up and make the diagnosis. If the targeted parent's abusing the child, tell me what it is. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, or psychological abuse. Tell me what it is and tell me why. Because I'm coming in as your second opinion. And the first thing I'm going to want to know is, what's the prior diagnosis and treatment plan? If that's what we do all the time. You're coming onto a case, you say, okay, the mental health people, let me see the diagnosis and treatment plan. And you don't have one. You don't have a diagnosis, you don't have a treatment plan, and you misdiagnosed a child abuse. You didn't even assess for it. So, so forensic psychology is in trouble. It got into trouble when it left. Now, in addition, let me see if I have it here. Oh yeah, here it is. In addition to all the other books I've read both of Stahl and Simon. The first one was Stahl and Simon, this one's Steinman and Stahl, of their Forensic Psychology Consultation in Child Custody Litigation, published by the American Bar Association Family Law Section. Okay, so this is the Bible of their child custody evaluations, and Simon and Stahl. I've read their 2013 version and I've read their 2020 version. It's basically identical. And so I know the forensic psychologist from inside out. And chapter 2 and chapter 3 is where I'm going to be focusing ultimately. I bring them up because what I'd like to do at some point is get a debate going. Dr. Childress on clinical psychology, and get either one of these guys to defend what they write in their book, child custody evaluations. So you put them on one side. I'd like a law school. Get a law school, put Stahl and Simon on, or either one, on one side, defending forensic psychology. Put me on the other side, talking about clinical psychology in the family courts. And let us moderate a debate. Let us go back and forth and talk about this. So one of the features that they describe, and then I'll be pulling up because I got their quotes. I pull them up in cross-examination. They're going to face a difficult cross-examination if ever they wind up in a case where I'm on it. They had to separate themselves as doing something different from clinical psychology in order to justify their existence. And so they do all this stuff that straw man arguments, that clinical psychology is somehow biased and they're going to be objective, and that's not true. And so the straw man right there. But clinical psychology isn't biased. We apply knowledge. Okay. And so family systems, we just don't accept what people tell us. We process it with knowledge, with research, with all this stuff. It's not biased. That's a straw man argument. And they're not objective. No, nothing's objective. They're bringing all their countertransference stuff to it, and they're not controlling for any of it. And so there's no integrated reliability on their stuff. It's just a mess what they're doing. But then they justify it by saying we don't do treatment, and we don't do. And so if you don't do treatment, if you don't fix anything, then what purpose do you have if you're not fixing anything? Listen to these two sentences. They mean exactly the same thing. We must first diagnose what the pathology is before we know how to treat it. We must first identify what the problem is before we know how to fix it. Diagnosis, identify, pathology, problem, treatment, fix it. So if they haven't identified what the problem is, how do they know what to do to fix it? But they tag right up front, our job is not to fix anything. Our job is to make recommendations about the child's custody schedule based on arbitrary criteria that we just make up. And then post apply the idea of best interests of the child. That's the craziest thing. They decide what they want to decide and then say, that's in the best interests of the child because that's what I've decided. It's like a little circular thing. There's no criteria by which they decide best interest because that's not possible. There's no criteria within psychology that would allow us to describe best interests. And when we don't have that debate about what is the best interests of the child, they've short-circuited that debate and they've just started to say, well, this is what it is, or this is, and they just make stuff up. So in order to get a handle on the stuff in the family courts in the 1980s, a whole new subspecialty was created, forensic psychologists, just especially for you, your own special psychologist. Meanwhile, all the clinical psychologists were sort of banned from being there, but also we don't mind because it's so dangerous in the family courts. There's three sources of danger currently. Back in the 80s, there was two. The major source of danger is your ex, the pathology of the dark triad, the narcissistic borderline pathology, extremely vengeful. And so the forensic psychologists, they come in, they don't solve anything, they don't fix anything, they don't try to interrupt the pathology. You all know that. And so the pathology doesn't seek revenge on them because they're part of it. They're cooperating with its manifestation. And so there's no danger to them. A clinical psychologist who comes in and tries to change and treat the child's attachment pathology, well, then they're messing with the narcissistic dark triad and they'll get the revenge. And so they'll face licensing board complaints and malpractice lawsuits. I faced them. I have never had a board complaint until I came into the courts. Now I'm like getting board complaints and even malpractice lawsuits. They were dismissed and everything's going away. Oregon's kind of hanging out there. But that Oregon's a second danger currently for clinical people. So the first danger is the pathology itself is very dangerous to clinical psychologists. The second danger is the court system. We have a human on cross-examination, opposing counsel, whose sole job it is to discredit us in any way possible, to slander us, to find any mistake we made, to just try to discredit. And they're working for a narcissistic borderline who wants to revenge. And we have to testify in court so we get a documented transcript where if we make a wrong word choice, that could show up in revenge on our licensing board or malpractice. And we just like, geez Louise, it is so dangerous to work for a clinical psychologist in the family courts. We like feelings. We like talking about getting along. And courts are so precise on their wording and everything. And you got a pathological parent who wants revenge. It's just dangerous. And when we go to our careers, get our doctorate degree, work all those 4 years for a doctorate degree, 2 years of supervised visitation, pre-doctoral, postdoctoral, just to sit for the licensing exam. Then we study for like 6 months for the licensing exam, take the licensing exam, and we're going to put all of that at risk because one person married a pathological other parent. and now they're fighting about custody. And our entire career will be put at risk for this family. No. And the way I describe it to attorneys is imagine that if each case you took, you had to put your law license on the line. Where a psychologist could look at your cross-examination, and if you didn't ask the right questions in the right way, then we could go after your law license. And it was a psychologist who was evaluating whether or not you asked the proper questions. I'm in the family courts. If I misask your question, all of a sudden you can go after my license on that. How many attorneys would work in the family courts if they had to put their law license on the line with every case? Zero. How many clinical psychologists will work in the family courts to put their license on the line? Zero. You don't have any clinical psychologists over here because we refuse to work with you. We decline. And so that was another part of creating forensic psychology, is it gave us a referral that we could kick you out. Forensic psychology is basically our bomb disposal unit. This extremely dangerous pathology, the most dangerous on the planet, narcissistic borderline dark triad. Yikes, cowabunga, that's a dangerous human. Machiavellian manipulation, vengeful, retaliatory, delusional, just a dangerous human. And as they're activated around their custody conflict. And so no clinical psychologist wants to work for that. So we created this bomb disposal unit, forensic psychology, and we toss all your parents in. The moment you go into the court, you're in that group. That's the definition. That's a crazy definition of a pathology. The moment you go into the court, you've now become a new pathology. No, you haven't. You're just same pathology, you're just now in the court system. Narcissistic borderline shared delusional pathology from the collapse. And that's true out here. That's true in the family courts. But that allows the clinical psychologists to all remain safe, and we go treat autism and ADHD and trauma and eating disorders and substance abuse, and everything else is safe for us. Everything else where they like us, where they invite us in, and they listen to what we do. Okay, in the family courts, we just say, I don't work with high conflict divorce. You want a forensic psychologist, and we refer you into that. I did that for 30 years of my career, my entire career until I came here. And it was only one minors council letter I got that I would typically throw in the trash. I said, let's see what's over here, because I know it's narcissistic borderline personality pathology, and I've worked everything, and this is my pathology trauma. Let's see why they're having such a problem solving it. Well, I found out. But so clinical psychologists have abandoned you. So that's the second thing to understand. So you're asking me for solutions. What's the solution? I said, go to find a DBT therapist. Go find an EFT therapist. What you're going to wind up in is you're going to go to them and they're going to say, I don't work with court-involved stuff. It's too dangerous. And so you will be forced to use a forensic psychologist. The two variants of a forensic is the child custody evaluation, $40,000, 6 to 9 months. It's a monstrosity of worthlessness. And it's simply because they're financially exploiting you for the money, solving nothing. And they put on their big child custody bomb disposal thing and they're going boom and explode the bomb. And they don't do anything. They recommend whatever the status quo is and boom, and they take their money. It's guaranteed money. And it's a nice cushy job for forensic psychology. So they're exploiting you for the money, and they control the licensing boards because this is a subspecialty practice. So all the complaints you make to the licensing board are going to other forensic psychologists. They get shunted out. So the complaint comes in, the moment they see it's court involved, that you're involved in the court, it automatically goes on a track over to the forensic psychologist. So clinical psychologists never see your complaints. The forensic psychologists all do the same custody evaluation. They all do exactly the same thing. So they look at it and say, oh, it's from the court. They did custody evaluation. This is just a grumpy client, and they throw it out. They never review your complaints. And so even though they're valid, even though the because they are all forensic psychologists. And if they sanction that one, they're going to have to sanction themselves because they do exactly the same thing. One of the features about the solution, just as a little side note, is as you continue to put in your board complaints around the same standards, 2.04, 9.01, add 2.01 boundaries of competence, you can add 3.04 avoiding harm. And when all the parents are making the same ethical allegations, and they are valid, that's going to force the licensing board, the forensic psychologists on the licensing board, both to look at the allegations and say, holy cow, that's true for me too. Holy cow, these are true allegations. And holy cow, we should be doing something on risk management because ultimately this is going to hit a malpractice lawsuit, which is where it needs to go because the licensing boards are covering up. We're just going to have to go into the courts to get an independent review of the corruption and unethical malpractice in forensic psychology. And so that's one place of outside review is malpractice from judges. The other place is the APA, but the APA is currently being disabled by the pathology, by the forensic psychologists, so they're being disabled. And the other review is of the state legislatures of the inactivity of the licensing boards. Why aren't they enforcing ethical code standards? Other clinical psychologists, we enforce ethical codes. Why? What's the problem with forensic psychology? Why are there no standards of practice over here? But that was, anyway, the one category is the forensic custody evaluators. The other category of forensic people are the reunification therapists. And you will know them because they use that word, reunification therapy. And there's no such thing. There's no book. There's nothing about it. They're trying to get something together recently. I've seen them probably because I've pointed it out. And so they're trying to throw something together. No, there's no such thing as reunification therapy. And what they do is the forensic custody evaluator on one case becomes the reunification therapist on another one. So they just pass you around amongst themselves. So there's a little group. Arizona, I haven't been there in a while in terms of looking at your mental health people there. But 5 or 6 years ago, there's a little like hornet's nest of mental health people that's just really a problem. I find that a lot of places there's a sort of incestuous mental health attorney kind of thing going on, but especially within the mental health people, custody evaluators and reunification therapists. And the fact that I use the word incestuous is not an accident. This is a rippling sex abuse pathology. So you will see a number of the themes. They will just be distributed rather than focused. And so those are your two forensic people. Reunification therapy, there's no such thing, and the child custody evaluators, which are pointless. What you want is a clinical diagnostic assessment. You want an assessment that reaches a diagnosis to guide the development of a treatment plan. That's in clinical psychology. You want a clinical diagnostic assessment. Of what? Of what? ADHD? No. Of autism? No. Of what? Of a possible shared delusional disorder. The source of the shared delusion is the collapse of a narcissistic borderline personality parent under stress of the divorce. And they're collapsing into delusional beliefs. We know that about personality pathology. Borderline, the term borderline comes from 1930s because that personality style is on the borderline between neurotic and psychotic. So a little stress, they go psychotic. We know that about borderlines. And like Milan, clearly, big quote on Milan says, narcissists collapse into persecutory delusions under stress. Take a look at, our Donald Trump. Narcissistic personality, he didn't win the election, collapses into persecutory delusions. They tried to steal the election from me. We know that about the personality pathologies. So you want a proper assessment for a possible delusional disorder, but more to the point is you want a proper risk assessment for possible child psychological abuse. And we need a diagnosis on that. Is there yes or no? Now, you go up to a forensic custody evaluator and say, do you diagnose pathology? They say no. Then you say, well, you're useless then because I need a diagnosis whether this is child abuse. If you're not going to diagnose child abuse, then you are pretty pointless in this matter. And so basically, we can just get rid of all the forensic psychologists. They don't solve anything. They don't diagnose. And they don't tell the court when child abuse is present. So that has me just off the charts. And so the forensic psychologist, when you don't diagnose a pathology, let me just share this with you for a second. When you don't diagnose a pathology, you say, I don't diagnose. The question then becomes, if the court, if there was child abuse in the family, would you tell the court about that? And they say, yes, if there's child abuse, I will tell the court. So you would diagnose or identify child abuse and tell the court, yes. Okay, the moment they say that, they're dead. Because did you do a proper assessment for possible psychological child abuse? Because maybe you missed it, and maybe you're not telling the court because maybe you're not diagnosing anything. The other thing is that when they don't put a diagnosis, you know what that means? As a clinical psychologist, I've been supervised, and I've supervised trainees, postdocs, interns. And I have both in my clinic and an APA internship at Chalk. I've supervised interns. And I've been told this as well. You always, always put your diagnosis, your DSM diagnosis, on all your formal paperwork. Always. You know why? It's a risk management thing. Because if you don't put a diagnosis, you are saying essentially there is no diagnosable pathology in the family. Otherwise, you would have diagnosed it, right? So there's no schizophrenia because otherwise you would have said there's schizophrenia, right? There's no child abuse. Otherwise, you would have said there's child abuse. Or you would have put it as a rule out if it was a possibility, RO, rule out child abuse, if it's a possible. But you didn't even say it's possible. So by not giving a diagnosis, you are asserting for a fact that you have verified that there is no diagnosable pathology in the family. You're dead in the water. Because all the opposing counsel has to do now is demonstrate that there might be a pathology in the family, and you have guaranteed by your assertion of fact that there is none. So that's an easy to draw you out, or draw out the mental health person on cross-examination and say, is it possible there's a shared delusional disorder? Did you do an assessment for a shared delusional disorder? Would that be child abuse? Did you do, what would be a proper assessment for psychological child abuse? Did you do it? You didn't talk about it anywhere in your report. Another rule about psychology, I learned this way back when I was working in hospitals, as a psych aide, early on in my master's degree, is if it's not charted, it didn't happen. Okay, so I don't care what you say. If it's not in your notes, it didn't happen. So if they got a report and they didn't discuss the possibility of child psychological abuse, they never assessed for it because it's not. They didn't write it down. They didn't write what the assessment was. They didn't write the conclusions. So these forensic psychologists are going to be in a lot of trouble. Part of my practice right now is reviewing these as second opinion and hopefully getting some sort of course correction when that's needed on the direction of the case, but also to provide the documentation necessary for the board complaints and potential malpractice lawsuits because I have obligations under standard 1.04 and 1.05. And so, but that's kind of a U area. I'm discharging my 1.05 obligations for additional action to you under the circumstances. But in addition to just me, I'm kind of like a bottleneck here because I'm one person. So, but you parents, you're doing a lot of pro se work, you're doing a lot of with your attorney's work and stuff. And so if I give you the knowledge, then you can also cross-examine. You can also get to the thought disorder of the forensic psychologist, and it is a thought disorder. Here's the thought disorder, by the way. If you haven't identified what the problem is, how do you know what to do to fix it? You don't. Are you treating cancer or diabetes? They'll say, I don't treat. Well, just move over to the common sense words. If you haven't identified what the problem is, how do you know what to do to fix it? Well, I have identified what the problem. Okay, what's your diagnosis? What is your? Well, I don't have a diagnosis. It's like they're thought disordered, and so you just expose that. So let me sort of recap here. Yeah, we're winding up on our time together this morning. So the situation that you've basically fallen into is we've got like Wonderland, Alice in Wonderland. You've fallen down a rabbit hole into this domain called forensic psychology, and it makes no sense. Up is down, right is left. The forensic psychologists are delusional. And here's another important piece to understand about them. They're not nice people. They're not good people. They're not here to help you. Okay, they are dangerous people to you and your children and family. All the forensic psychologists, do not trust them. Do not trust any of the mental health people around you until you see signs that they are trustworthy. And here's basically why. This pathology is a shared delusional disorder, a shared delusional pathology. That's an interesting pathology in psychology. There is no other shared pathology. We don't have shared autism. We don't have shared ADHD. We don't have shared eating disorder. We have shared delusions. They're called a shared delusional disorder. They're also called an induced delusional disorder. Yep, induced delusional disorder. There's two sources of the delusion. One is a psychotic source, so we have a schizophrenic or psychotically delusional parent who imposes it. The other source for a delusion, though, is trauma. It's the narcissistic borderline parent who collapses into delusion. So we have two sources of delusions possibly creating the delusional disorder, and ours is on the trauma line, not the psychotic line. So we're over here. Now, interestingly, about a shared delusional disorder, because it's unique within mental health, is that if you believe the shared delusion, you become part of the shared delusion. You become part of the pathology, like QAnon or the election fraud. If you believe the shared delusion, you become part of the shared delusion. You become part of the pathology. Now, when that pathology is child abuse, you become part of the child abuse. So the forensic psychologists who believe that the child's delusional persecution beliefs about the targeted parent and say, well, that targeted parent, the child believes they're abusive and we need to, like restrict their time and put them on. If they believe that shared delusion, they become part of the shared delusion. That's the ally. They become part of the child abuse. The mental health person, the forensic psychologist, becomes a child abuser. I knew this back in 2008. Once I get over here as a psychologist and I start working it out and I go, holy cow, this is a shared delusion. And these psychologists are believing the shared delusion. They are the child abusers. Because typically what I would do is an easy solution. Because what I would do is I see you come in with your child abuse kind of situation, I would refer you into your local mental health people to get a diagnosis. Easy peasy. But I can't, because the local mental health people are the child abusers. They're colluding with, they're the allies of the child, because they've been captivated into that social distribution feature, the shared belief system, the shared persecutory delusion, just like the election fraud kind of stuff going on, QAnon stuff going on. They bought, the mental health people, the forensic psychologists have bought in to the false belief. Yikes, cowabunga, they're the child abusers. So that's why I'm going after their license, because of their ignorance, incompetence, laziness, just absolute malpractice. They are part of the child abuse. And so we can't, and so they're doing that. Final thing I just want to close here with this, and this whole long kind of orientation session this morning, is about the second diagnosis in the family. So the first diagnosis in the DSM, so you're already in the DSM. You don't need to get anybody to accept any parental alienation. No, you're already in the DSM. It's on page 719. Child psychological abuse. You're already there. It's a shared delusional disorder is child psychological abuse. So we get the delusion. That automatically defines it as child psychological abuse. You're already in the DSM. You don't have to prove anything. And but the second diagnosis that's involved here is spouse or partner abuse, psychological. That's V995.82. Spouse or partner abuse, psychological. And in this case, it's using the child as the weapon. Okay, so it's psychological abuse of the ex-spouse and parent using the child as a weapon. Very brutal child abuse too, taking your child away from you. Holy cow, what's worse than that in terms of your pain and suffering? So it's very, very brutal spousal abuse. And they're not diagnosing that or protecting you either on that. So it's a failure of duty to protect on two independent counts, related but independent. Failure to protect the child from child abuse, failure to protect the spouse from spousal abuse because of their ignorance and incompetence and laziness and just general malpractice. They don't think they need to know anything. And Dr. Childress, I've defined it all through established psychology. There is no new theory from Dr. Childress. So let me close up with that. There's no new theory from Dr. Childress. The pathogen is a trauma pathogen. It's damaged information structures in the attachment networks in childhood trauma that then produce a characteristic pattern of behavior in the adult. And so it's the pathogen itself. I mentioned how I read its source code, and that's an interesting thing. Nobody's asking me out of psychology yet, hey, Dr. Childress, what's the source code for the pathology? None of the psychologists are asking me anything yet. They will be. That I've read the source code. I can tell you what the pathology is going to do before it does it, because it's pattern. Trauma is pattern. Trauma is the replication of pattern. We've known that since Freud. Freud was the first one who identified that. He calls it the transference. You take your childhood trauma and you transfer it onto the analyst. And then the analyst has countertransference, their own childhood traumas that they transfer back onto you. That's rampant in forensic psychology. Oh, they're countertransference. They had a bad relationship with their mommy. They got mommy issues. The psychologist had a bad wife. He's got wife-mother issue. Their countertransference is huge over here. And there's no control for it. Absolutely none. So they're just individual. It's just a mess. But and so that the trauma is pattern. And so I know that. I'm a trauma psychologist. The pathogen is going to attack new stuff using the same pattern it used with Gardner's PAS, which was junk science. There's no peer-reviewed research, and so it'll be junk science. There'll be where's the peer-reviewed research? Those two will go together. And then it will seek to slander my reputation. Dr. Childress is a pedophile, or it'll come up with some variant of that. That slander my professional reputation somehow. And so it's attack on Gardner, and it worked. So that'll be the attack it applies on me. New theory, peer-reviewed research, and Dr. Childress is a pedophile. New theory. So I addressed that. There's nothing in this that's new to Dr. Childress. This is Bowlby, Minuchin, Beck. I used all of the established psychological knowledge, nothing of Dr. Childress. So I essentially solved this pathology, diagnosed it with both hands tied behind my back, because nothing is me. Now, I will ultimately come with all sorts of knowledge that I have that's like, ooh, Dr. Childress, that's wonderful knowledge. However, I'm not using any of that here because everybody fights about everything. So I have to get past that new theory part. So I just didn't use any of me. All of it's Bowlby, Minuchin, Beck. There's no new theory here. If somebody claims there's a new theory with ABPA, they are simply exposing their ignorance and their laziness. Okay? And the fact that they're a pathology just attacking out a pattern without any cognitive processing of the issue. And so that in that way, ABPA is a pathogen identifier, because it's going to draw out the attacks that are patterned but are not reasoned. And so you automatically go, you're just making a pattern allegation, but you're not actually engaging the cognitive material. And I did that on purpose. So ABPA is a pathogen identifier in your mental health people. If they listen to it, there's no pathogen. If they reject it, because they're rejecting knowledge. Bowlby, Minuchin, Beck. There's nothing Dr. Childress here. So that's the first one. The second one is peer-reviewed research. They're going to attack the pathogens. They're going to attack on that. No, because Bowlby, Minuchin, Beck has all been peer-reviewed. Second, peer-reviewed research is about research. It's not about clinical psychology and diagnosis. Third, though, and this is my response, you want peer review on ABPA, go ahead, peer review it. That's why I wrote Foundations, okay, is for peer review. So read Foundations, peer review it. You're the peer and not me. I can't give peer review on my own work, okay, because I originated. So if somebody wants peer review, go ahead, peer review it. Let's hear it. And they have no peer review because ABPA is 100% true and accurate. I applied knowledge and argue with Bowlby, argue with Milan, argue with Beck. Don't argue with me. That's what they said. So That's the second one, peer-reviewed research. And then it's going to try to slander me, Dr. Childress, as board complaints or whatever it tries to use, which kind of wraps around. I forgot to mention the third source of danger to psychologists over here, clinical psychologists. The first one is the pathological parent. The second one is the court system and just the dangerousness of opposing counsel. The third danger to clinical psychologists over here are the forensic psychologists, because now that they're guarding their turf. If a clinical psychologist comes over here and does anything a forensic psychologist doesn't like, they'll sanction us on the licensing board. Okay, and there's nothing we can do to fight it because it's a licensing board. And there's forensic psychologists on the licensing board. So the mere fact that we didn't do what they do as forensic psychologists will get us sanctioned. And I'll hold up Oregon and sanctioning my license as an example of that. I consulted with Dorsey Pruder. She's in California. I'm licensed in California. She's a business organization. I didn't even meet with the parents. I didn't meet with anybody. She gave me data based on my book. The diagnostic indicators, frequency counts on the diagnostic indicators. I gave her opinion about the frequency counts on diagnostic indicators, and I'm practicing in Oregon without a license because her client is in Oregon. Well, wait a minute. Okay. First, I'm exempted by Oregon statute from that for consulting with business organizations and stuff on that. But I didn't consult with anybody in Oregon. Okay, and the report I provided to Ms. Pruder, you know what it was used for? To file a licensing board complaint against the forensic psychologist involved because they refused to diagnose or refused to look at anything, diagnose anything. They were saying, nope, not going to look, nope, not going to look. So then when I wrote a report said, looks like child abuse, they filed a licensing board complaint against the involved forensic psychologist. That was the only use of my report, is to file a licensing board complaint in Oregon against a forensic psychologist. And the Oregon licensing board sanctioned me for practice in Oregon without a license. And I've got their expert testimony. And the reason was the forensic psychologists couldn't understand my report. They said, I don't understand what this is. I don't get it. So he must be practicing in Oregon without a license. Honest to God, that's what they said. So I have it under appeal. It's cost me about $50,000 to appeal a $7,000 sanction for practice in Oregon. No clinical psychologist is going to come work with your families. No, they're not going to do it. And so that's the collusion within psychology, is until we deal with the danger over here and get an actual response to the danger instead of just isolating you to your own destruction, then this stuff is going to go on. We need to get clinical psychology back. They're not going to come because it's too dangerous. Then we need to make it safe for them, which is what I've done. ABPA makes it safe. Walk where I walk, do what I do. Just follow the diagnostic checklist, the parenting practices rating scale, toss on the parent-child relationship rating scale as an outcome measure. You just do that, everything will be fixed and you'll be safe. Stay in diagnosis, don't move to custody on that. My cuckoo clock says it's time to be leaving. So let me wait till the clock ends to finish up and wrap up one more time with Jungian psychology and the journey that you are on. So in my practice, in my office, right next to my seat where I sit, among the books, you go into a psychologist's office and you see all their books, and I like to read them to kind of get an orientation to who they are. But next to where I am, I have two books. The first is the Iliad, translated by Pope. Okay, so Iliad by Homer. And I read this a long time ago. I love Pope's translation of the Iliad. It was so great. I read the Iliad because Julian Jaynes referenced it in the Origins of Consciousness in the breakdown of the bicameral mind. And I always go to source material. So he said he was making the argument based on Achilles and the Iliad. So I went back and read the Iliad. But then I also got into Joseph Campbell in that domain, looking at things out of Jung into Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell referenced The Golden Bough by Fraser. So I read The Golden Bough by Fraser. And I bring these both up to emphasize that I don't do derivative stuff so much. I go back to source material and as much as possible on stuff. And so with Jungian stuff, I know I can get you back into like all the ancient myths and all the sorts of things like that. And just to give you an indication of what I'm doing now. So I gave you the other books and I said, oh, if you want to look into like the future of stuff, go to, Daniel Stern and look at intersubjectivity. I'm going to say there's another direction you can also go. So I'm reading Circe right now. Okay, I'm reading about gods and witches and stuff. The this is our myths, and we are currently in a myth reformation period, the Age of Heroes. You can see it with Thor and Spider-Man and all of our mythologies that we are recreating into an age of myth. Our last age of myth ended the the Iliad, with the Odyssey. Okay, these guys were born of gods. Achilles was half god. We don't have that after this time period. Okay, and when you go into the Peloponnesian Wars, nobody's claiming Pericles is our half god. But we're in a god's reformation now. Batman and all of that, Dungeons and Dragons, looking at the mythologies. We are reforming our mythologies for a new life, and so within that situation, this particular uh, pathology in the family courts would be, I'm looking at it, it's kind of like the Odyssey, and that's why I'm reading Circe right now. Um, and you guys are on a hero's journey from Joseph Campbell. You're discovering your power, you're discovering your weapons, your magical weapons to use and to get out of to defeat the various monsters and escape the various dungeons that you're trapped in. It's dangerous, absolutely. This is the most dangerous pathogen on the planet, and you have everything you need. You have all the knowledge available to you. You have the support you need. I'm support from psychology. Dorsey Pruder offers support from coaching, and her experience and knowledge. She's the most knowledge professional out here. She's worked with this for 10 years, up close and personal, and so she gives good advice and good counsel on this. Um, and so you have the support necessary. It's tough. I know it's tough. I know there's a lot of barriers you face, especially in the mental health people. I'm working to break those down. But the reason I wanted to give you this sort of framework about where you are relative to forensic psychology is to help you understand that you need to escape. You need to escape to the clinical psychologist, and you need to bring them in for a diagnosis and a treatment plan. The one you want to look for is a DBT, dialectic behavior therapist, Linehan. They're the personality folks. The real therapy is with emotionally focused therapy, Sue Johnson, EFT. They're the attachment folks. But the attachment folks are too soft to come into the family courts for personality pathology. They don't have the structure to EFT yet. So that's where you look for the DBT therapist. They'll be strong enough to deal with the personality pathology. They won't come. They'll say no because you're involved in the court. That's where you can use me as the interface. I can help them come in, and I can deal with the court aspect of it to keep them safe, and they can just stay focused on the clinical aspect, get a diagnosis and a treatment plan, and you get me consulting with them, the two of us together. So we go in as a joint diagnosis to the court. So that's, you go to the attorney's resource page on my consulting website, go down to the telehealth consultation, and it gives like a menu of different ways to get me involved in consultation. The best is the top option, get me involved on the assessment itself. If that DBT therapist is willing to consult with me, yay, then we get two diagnoses coming into the court, or a confirmed diagnosis, second opinion coming into the court that the court can then rely on. If the opposing party wants a third one, we can get three psychologists on and give a court a great report. But we need to stop the fight and fight. And so rather than get a diagnosis and then dispute it and get a second opinion on it, let's just get the two second opinion right up front. Boop, boop, and get a clinical diagnostic assessment, get that back to the court, and get solving this on treatment within 2 months. Okay, the clinical diagnostic assessment can be brought back within 2 months for around $5,000-ish for two opinions, $2,500 roughly for the clinical diagnostic assessment, and then a second opinion on that would be roughly double that. And then you get a diagnosis, you get a treatment plan, and we fix this, and we start moving forward on things. And so that's, you got to get out. You got to face a barrier. The solution to the barrier is to get me involved in a second opinion consultation, and then ultimately is to get changes through the licensing boards where they establish standards of practice, and it's based ultimately to get the APA to look at what's happening in the family courts. Let's have a conference with attachment people, personality people, complex trauma people, family systems people, ethics people, psychometric assessment people, no forensic people. Boop, you're out. But everybody else, let's have a big old APA sponsored conference to figure out what we're doing in the family courts. I'd also recommend we get a pilot program for the family courts. ABPA, Dorsey and I can put together the structure of that that will allow the university involvement to then work out the diagnostic protocol, the treatment protocol, and the legal foundations for that as we're doing the ABPA pilot program. And then you have, as Dorsey and I leave, you have all the diagnostic protocol and the treatment protocol and the underlying legal arguments. Okay, that's what clinical psychologists are. We're catalysts. So you bring me in, catalyze the formation of that, and leave you with that, and then that model can be replicated everywhere because you have the diagnostic model, you have the treatment model, and you have the legal arguments to support it. And then if you want to modify it, you take it back to universities and let them do different things and study it and do research on it. So we need to get research over here. That's an absolute fact. The reason it can't come prior to this is because PAS doesn't lend itself to research. There's no operational definitions for anything. ABPA, nice operational definition for what the pathology is, the diagnostic checklist, and all of that. And then, oh my goodness, you have all the associated clinical signs. The associated clinical signs are the only thing that's Dr. Childress. So if it says new theory, yes, associated clinical signs are Dr. Childress. So if it's a problem, just jettison those. But boy, use them. That's what I suggest. The moment we get on the other side, those ACS are really, really good to kind of support stuff. So with that, I'm going to start getting ready for my Saturday appointments here. I'll look back at all your comments at my leisure on this. So let me see if there's something I can kind of sum up on. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm treating the trauma in parents that is being caused by forensic psychologists. That is the most insane thing in the world, that a clinical psychologist is treating the traumatic grief that's being caused by other psychologists. If they would simply stop causing the traumatic grief in parents, then I wouldn't need to treat the traumatic grief they are causing. And by causing traumatic grief in parents, they are in violation of standard 3.04, avoiding harm. Blatant violation of avoiding harm, because they simply don't care about the life, feelings, or psychological health of the parent. There is no more valuable, important role for a human being than being mother and father. Holy cow, you dream of that as a child when you're going to be mom and dad. And that's a central identity for who you are. You give up your name when your child is born. You're no longer Bob or Mary. You're your mom, your dad. You give up your name. That's your identity. And that's being taken from these people. They are no longer mom or dad. They are no longer part of a family. They no longer have children. The grief is phenomenal in these parents. And the psychologists simply don't care. And they're colluding with it. They are taking the children away from these parents. And I have to come in and treat the parents and treat their trauma and treat their grief. That's insane. Forensic psychologists, stop it. Learn what you're doing, for Jesus, like all out. Read. Holy Toledo. Family, where is it? Family evaluation. Murray Bowen, 1988, 40 years ago. For geez, read family evaluation if you're going to do a family evaluation, you stupid forensic psychologist. They don't. They don't. They just don't care. And they're allowed to not care because nobody oversees them, not the APA, not the licensing boards. Are just allowed not to care and destroy your lives. So that's where I am. We just keep going forward um, and solving things. I'll check in with you next week. We'll see. We'll see what I talk about next week. I'd like to talk more about the Jungian stuff actually, and where we are with some of this, and it ties in to some degree on the themes of the sex abuse in this. That we're patterns and we're activating a lot of our unconscious stuff. The narcissistic borderline is fully collapsing into their narcissistic and borderline stuff, and the surrounding countertransference of everybody is all in their patterns as well. You're living in a delusional world. It makes no sense, and that's true. It makes no sense. You're caught in a delusion. So with that, bye bye everybody, and we will see you next week. Bye bye.